I had just turned 62 when my body finally gave out on me. Not in a dramatic way, not the way you'd imagine. It wasn't a car accident or a fall down the stairs. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October, and I was standing at the kitchen sink washing the lunch dishes, and I simply couldn't lift my right arm anymore. It felt like someone had stuffed wet sand into my shoulder and sewn the skin back up over it. I stood there for a moment, water still running, and I thought, this is strange. Then I turned off the faucet, dried my hands very carefully on the dish towel, sat down at the kitchen table, and started to cry. Not because of the arm. I've been ignoring things like that for months. I cried because my husband was going to come home at 6 o'clock, find me sitting there with a puffy face, and the first thing out of his mouth would be, "What did you do now?" That was the word he used. Do. As if every bad thing that happened to me was something I had caused. As if pain was a choice I kept making on purpose just to inconvenience him. I want to back up a little, because if I'm going to tell this story, I want to tell it right. I want you to understand how a person gets there, how a woman who has a graduate degree, who taught middle school English for 21 years, who raised 2 kids and kept a home and volunteered at the library on Saturday mornings, how that woman ends up sitting at her kitchen table at 62, afraid to have a sore shoulder. His name was Kenneth. We met when I was 34. I was divorced, my kids were small, I was tired in that bone-deep way that single mothers know. He was charming in the way that men who are eventually cruel are almost always charming at the beginning. He brought flowers to our 3rd date. He remembered that I took my coffee with oat milk before I even told him twice. He called my daughter sweetheart and taught my son how to fish. I thought I had won something. The first time he raised his voice at me, we'd been married about 8 months. I had forgotten to pick up his dry cleaning. I didn't just forget. I had a migraine. I had called the school to cover my afternoon classes. I had barely made it home before collapsing onto the couch. He came home at 6:30, asked where his gray suit was, and when I told him I hadn't made it to the cleaners, something moved across his face that I hadn't seen before. Something cold. "You had one thing to do," he said. Just that. "One thing to do," he said. Then he went upstairs and didn't speak to me for 3 days. I apologized. Of course I did. I told myself it was the stress of his job, his demanding mother, the pressure he was under. I found explanations the way some people find spare change, always enough tucked in a pocket somewhere to get through one more day. The thing about a marriage like that is you don't recognize it while you're in it. You think you're just having a rough patch. You think all marriages have friction. You think the problem is you too sensitive, too emotional, too forgetful, too much. And he was very good at reinforcing that. Other women don't fall apart over nothing. I don't know why everything has to be such a production with you. You're lucky I have patience. Patience. He used that word like a gift he was giving me, like I should be grateful for his restraint. My kids grew up and moved away. My daughter went to Atlanta for work. My son is in Oregon now with his wife and their 2 little boys. They called on Sundays. I kept the conversations cheerful. I had become very skilled at cheerful. It was only after I retired from teaching, 3 years ago now, that things shifted in a way I couldn't manage anymore. When I was working, I had somewhere to go every morning. I had a reason to get dressed, to be competent, to be myself. The classroom was the only place where I still felt like the person I used to be before Kenneth slowly talked me into believing I was someone smaller. Retirement took that from me. Suddenly, I was home all day, and he had new opinions about how I spent every hour. Why was the television on at 2 in the afternoon? Why hadn't I started dinner by 4? Why was I on the phone with my sister so long? Why did I need to drive all the way to the other grocery store when the closer one was perfectly fine? I started timing my phone calls. I started having dinner ready at 4:30 just to be safe. I stopped seeing my friend Paulette because the drive to her house was 35 minutes each way, and Kenneth thought that was excessive for just lunch. And then came the shoulder. I know now, my doctor told me later, that I had a rotator cuff tear that had probably been aggravating for months, possibly longer. The kind of thing that develops slowly, that gets worse if you don't rest it, that you can push through for a while until suddenly you can't. That Tuesday, when I sat at the kitchen table, I had been pushing through it for at least 4 months. I hadn't mentioned it to Kenneth because the last time I'd had a health issue, a kidney infection 2 winters before, he had spent the entire week I was ill making pointed comments about the inconvenience, about how he had to fend for himself, about how other people managed to stay healthy. So I sat at the table and waited. He came home at 6. He looked at me. He looked at the counter where nothing was cooking, where there were no smells of dinner, where the dish towel was still folded wrong from when I dried my hands. "What's the matter with you?" he said. Not a question, just a statement of irritation. I told him about my shoulder. I kept my voice very steady and factual, the way I used to explain assignment requirements to 7th graders. Just the information, no drama. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from me and looked at me the way he looks at me when I've done something stupid. "You've probably just slept on it wrong," he said. "Take some ibuprofen." I said I didn't think it was that. I said I thought I needed to see a doctor. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And who's going to pay for that?" "We have insurance. We have perfectly good insurance." He knew that. But this was a technique of his, making the resources we both had together sound like something he was personally funding for me out of charity. "Who's going to pay for that?" was a way of saying, "Your needs are a financial burden I am generously absorbing." I made an appointment anyway. I went alone on a Thursday morning while he was at work. The doctor, a young woman named Dr. Whitmore, barely 40, kind eyes, efficient manner, confirmed the rotator cuff tear and gave me a referral for an orthopedic specialist. She also asked me, almost as an aside while she was typing up the referral, whether I was sleeping all right, whether I was under any unusual stress. I said I was fine. She looked at me for just a second longer than the question required. Then she went back to typing. I thought about that look on the drive home. I thought about it while I made dinner. I thought about it for several days afterward. I don't know exactly what she saw, but I know she saw something. The orthopedic appointment was 3 weeks later. I drove myself. Kenneth knew I was going and had already made clear that he couldn't take time off work to come with me, which I had not asked him to do, and which he said anyway in a tone that made it sound like I had. The specialist, an older man, Dr. Okafor, gray at the temples, very calm, confirmed everything and recommended physical therapy first before considering surgery. He was explaining the schedule to me when the nurse came in to take some baseline notes. Her name was Shondra. She was probably mid-50s, broad shoulders, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She asked me the usual questions, medical history, medications, allergies, and then she asked about pain levels. I said the shoulder was a 6 on its worst days. She nodded, wrote something down, and then, without looking up from her clipboard, she said, "And what about everywhere else?" I blinked. "I'm sorry?" She looked up then. Sometimes when people have been managing pain for a long time, they get used to ignoring other things. I just want to make sure we're getting the full picture. I told her I was fine. She put the clipboard down on the counter, leaned back slightly, and said, "How long have you had that bruise on your forearm?" I looked down. There it was. A bruise I had stopped seeing because I had learned not to look. Yellow-green now, so several days old at least, on the inside of my left forearm, where a hand had gripped too hard during an argument about whether I'd given the neighbor the wrong impression about our driveway easement. I had learned to wear long sleeves. I had been wearing a cardigan even though it was warm in the office. I had pulled the sleeve up to roll it for the blood pressure cuff without thinking. The silence between us lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then I said very quietly, "I fell." Shondra didn't say anything. She just looked at me with an expression that wasn't pity, wasn't alarm. It was something more like recognition, like she had heard that sentence before from other women in other offices, and she understood exactly what it meant and what it didn't mean. She said, "Dr. Okafor is going to step out for a few minutes to take a call. Is it all right if I just stay and finish up these notes with you?" It was such a small thing to say, such a careful, gentle way to give me a door. Dr. Okafor left, and I don't know what happened to me in that room, with that woman, in that quiet office with the paper on the table crinkling every time I shifted my weight. Maybe it was the years of it. Maybe it was the shoulder that I had been carrying for months, like a secret shame. Maybe it was 62 years of being told I was too much and realizing I had become too little. I started to cry, and this time it wasn't the quiet, self-contained crying I did at the kitchen table. It shook through me. Shondra didn't reach for a tissue right away. She just stayed very still and let it happen. And then when I started to collect myself, she handed me the tissues and sat down in the chair beside me, not across from me, beside me. And she said, "You don't have to tell me anything, but if you want to, I'm not going anywhere." So I told her, not everything, not all at once, not organized. It came out in pieces, the dry cleaning and the 3 days of silence, the kidney infection, the who's going to pay for that, the neighbor, the sleeve. 32 years of pieces. She listened. She didn't tell me what to do. She didn't say, "You should leave him," or "Have you tried talking to him," or any of the things people say when they're uncomfortable with the size of what you're sharing. She just listened and occasionally said things like, and "I hear you." Then she asked, very gently, whether I would be willing to talk to someone at the patient advocacy office before I left today. Not the police, not a social worker from the government, just a woman down the hall who talked with patients about options. Just a conversation. I said yes. I think I surprised myself when I said it. Her name was Gwen. She was maybe 45, professional, a kind of brisk warmth about her that I appreciated. She wasn't going to let me deflect, but she also wasn't going to make me feel like a case study. She sat down across from me and she said, "Shondra told me you might want some information. I'm just here to give you information. You decide what you do with it." We talked for 40 minutes. She told me about the county domestic violence resources. There was a hotline, there was a shelter, there was a legal aid clinic that specifically handled situations like mine, which she described as financial and emotional abuse with incidents of physical contact. Hearing that phrase, physical contact, made me want to laugh, which I realized was a defense mechanism which I had been using for 30 years. She gave me a card, a plain white card with a phone number. She said I could call any time, even just to talk, even if I wasn't ready to do anything else. I put it in the inside pocket of my purse, under my insurance card, where Kenneth would never look. I drove home. I made dinner. I was very cheerful at dinner. But I kept thinking about Shondra's face when I said I fell. That look of recognition. The way she'd offered me a door so quietly that it hadn't even felt like an intervention. It had felt like someone just noticing me. I called the hotline on a Friday morning 3 weeks later when Kenneth was at his weekend golf game. I sat in the car in the parking lot of the grocery store so I wouldn't be home. I talked for 50 minutes. The woman on the other end, I never learned her name, had a calm and measured voice, and she walked me through what an exit plan looked like for someone in my situation. Retired, financially dependent, no immediate family in the area. She asked me if I had a safe person I could contact. And I thought of my sister in Michigan, and I thought of Paulette, who I hadn't been to see in almost 2 years because Kenneth thought it was excessive. I called Paulette that afternoon. I told her some of it. She cried. She said, "I've been waiting for you to call me for 2 years. She said I could come stay with her whenever I needed to. She said to say the word. I won't pretend the next few months were simple. They weren't. Leaving a marriage at 62, leaving a life you have organized around another person for 32 years, is not a thing that happens quickly or cleanly. There were days I talked myself out of everything I had decided. There were nights I lay awake and thought about money and health insurance and what my son would say and whether Kenneth was right that I was making everything into a production. But I kept the card in my purse, and I kept talking to the woman at the hotline. And I started meeting with the legal aid attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Miss Ferreira, who wore excellent blazers and did not accept the word fine as an answer to her questions. Ms. Ferreira helped me understand what I was entitled to: 32 years of marriage, my own retirement contributions that I had made throughout my teaching career, a share of the house we had paid into together. She was very clear and very practical, and when I apologized once for not having started this sooner, she said, "You started it now. That's what matters." I left on a Wednesday in March. Not dramatically. I had packed 2 bags over the course of several weeks, a little at a time, storing them at Paulette's house. I had transferred my own financial records. I had made copies of the documents Ms. Ferreira needed. Kenneth came home that evening to a letter on the kitchen table. Ms. Ferreira had helped me write it. It said what needed to be said. It had her contact information at the bottom. I was already at Paulette's when he read it. He called 7 times that first night. I didn't answer. I sat on Paulette's couch with a cup of tea and her old dog leaning against my leg, and I let it ring. The divorce took 11 months. It was not pleasant. Kenneth hired an attorney who was skilled at delay tactics and at making me feel, through paperwork and deposition language, like I was the one who had done something wrong. There were moments when I nearly caved, not because I wanted to go back, but because I was so tired of fighting and the fight was expensive and exhausting. But I didn't cave, and eventually it was done. I'm 64 now. I live in a small apartment 20 minutes from Paulette. My shoulder healed mostly after physical therapy and some time. My daughter came up from Atlanta in the spring, and we spent a week just being together, just talking, really talking, the way we hadn't been able to do in years because I was always managing what I said, always performing fine. She cried. I cried. It was the best week I'd had in a long time. My son called last month and said something I keep going back to. He said, "Mom, I always knew something wasn't right. I just didn't know what to do." And I said, "Neither did I, sweetheart. Neither did I for a very long time." I tell this story because there's something I want you to hear, especially if you're someone sitting somewhere right now with a bruise you've stopped looking at, or a reason you've trained yourself not to need things, or a voice in your head that sounds suspiciously like someone else's words telling you that you're too much, that you cause your own problems, that you are lucky someone has patience with you. I want you to know that a nurse named Shondra, in a routine orthopedic appointment on a Thursday morning when I thought I was just there to talk about my shoulder, she noticed. She didn't push. She just opened a door very quietly and waited to see if I'd walk through it. You don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to have a plan. You just have to be willing, when someone opens a door, to take one step toward it. That's all it took for me. One step, and then another, and then another. And I am here, 64 years old, sitting in my own apartment with my own coffee made the way I like it, talking to no one about what time dinner should be ready. And I want you to know it is so much quieter here. In the best possible way. It is so much quieter here. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in a mystical way, just in the plain, honest way that you do when you finally have enough quiet to think straight. You start to trace things back. You start to see the through line. For 32 years, I made choices that seemed small in the moment. I apologized for the dry cleaning. I timed my phone calls. I stopped driving to Paulette's because 35 minutes felt like too much to defend. Each one of those choices was reasonable on its own. Each one made sense given the pressure of that particular day, but stacked together over decades, they built something I couldn't see from the inside, a version of myself that had become almost entirely organized around managing someone else's comfort. I had traded my own life, one small concession at a time, and I had done it so gradually that I called it marriage. That's what I want to say about cause and effect. Not that I deserved what happened. Nobody deserves that, but that our choices compound. The ones we make toward ourselves and the ones we make away from ourselves. Every time I chose silence, I was also choosing to stay smaller. And eventually the body keeps the score, whether you're paying attention or not. My shoulder knew before I did. What I didn't expect was that the thing that cracked it open wouldn't be a dramatic confrontation. It would be a woman named Shondra, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, noticing something I had stopped seeing. That's the part I come back to most. She didn't rescue me. She couldn't. Only I could do that. But she looked at me at a moment when I had spent years training myself to be invisible, and she saw me anyway, and she used that scene not to alarm me, not to push me, but just to quietly make a space where truth was possible. That takes a particular kind of intelligence. Not book intelligence, something quieter. The intelligence of paying attention, of understanding that someone who has been controlled for a long time doesn't need to be told what to do. She needs someone to hold the door open and step back. I think about the woman I was at 62, sitting at the kitchen table with a shoulder I couldn't lift, already rehearsing how to explain my pain in a way that would be acceptable. That woman had courage. She didn't know she had. She had survived 32 years and raised children and built a career and kept herself going on next to nothing, emotionally speaking. She was not weak. She had just been using all her strength in the wrong direction for too long. And here is what I know now, 2 years on the other side. The strength doesn't go anywhere. You don't lose it. You just have to redirect it. Toward yourself, for once. Toward the life that was waiting for you the whole time, patient as anything, just on the other side of one very quiet door. Paulette still laughs about the fact that I apologized when I first called her, said I was sorry for being out of touch so long. She said, "Don't you dare apologize." She was right. I was done apologizing for things that weren't mine to carry. That's the whole story, really. You put down what isn't yours, you pick up what is, and then you go make your coffee exactly the way you like it, and you sit in your own apartment and you breathe.